Listen, when you grew up in the South, you'll hear a lot of sayings. One of them being, if people ain't calling you crazy, you're doing something wrong. Right? What's another one? If you live long enough, you're going to hear people say a lot of things about you. One of them being calling you crazy, right? So you ain't been called crazy, then you're probably doing something wrong. Keep going. It'll happen. You know what I mean? And this video here is the 10 crazy people who were finally proven right. The irony in that. Let's get to it.
In a controversial world, the visionaries, geniuses, and outcasts have been deemed unhinged. But through challenging the norms and being run down, they turned out to be errorless. Number 10. Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian physician, was born in 1818 in Hungary. It was an era in which the burning of accused witches was coming to an end, but it was also a period still marred by misunderstandings and misinformation. Anyone who dared to challenge the norms was quickly viewed as an outcast. They were belittled and made fun of, underestimated, and scoffed at. When Semmelweis stepped into the world of medicine, he would become one such individual who was brave enough to provoke the standards. He'd been educated at the universities of both Pest and Vienna, earning his doctor's degree in 1844 and being appointed as the assistant in a Vienna obstetric clinic. It was during this era that disease was no longer viewed as the possession of evil spirits, but rather in an anatomical way. Medicine and biological understanding, though, were still in their early stages. It was a time when gloves were not a standard in medical practices. The mortality rates were alarmingly high.
Listen, all my OCD people going crazy right now because they can't picture a time when gloves and hand washing wasn't a thing, bro. You ever been around somebody really, really got OCD bad? Hearing something like that would make their skin crawl.
Specifically in expecting mothers. Most women at this time would deliver at home, but some had to seek hospitalization due to poverty or sometimes complications. But these complications weren't helped by the growing surge of infections that spread throughout hospitals. One such infection was known as childbed fever or postpartum infection. The bacterial contamination would be characterized by abdominal pain, chills, and serious fevers, often leading to fatal ends. It was believed that the onset of lactation, miasma, overcrowding, and poor ventilation caused the infections. Semmelweis, though, didn't believe that these were the main problems and proceeded to investigate despite the strong objections of his chief, who believed that childbed fever was unpreventable. Through his investigation, the physician would observe the women and everything that was happening around them. Semmelweis would focus his attention on 2 wards in the hospital. One of them was staffed by male doctors and medical students, and the other by female midwives. He began tallying up the number of fatalities in each ward. It was soon discovered that the first ward saw a mortality rate 5 times higher than that of the second. But why? Semmelweis began making other observations. He noticed that in the midwives' ward, the women would give birth while lying on their sides, so he suggested that the same practice be used in the other ward, but still the fever and fatalities remained. He then noticed that whenever someone would pass away, a priest would walk through the hospital ringing a bell. Semmelweis wondered if the bell was frightening the women so much that it made them sick. The priest was instructed to ditch the bell, but still there were no improvements. By this time, the physician was frustrated and decided to take leave, and when he returned, a revelation was waiting for him. Upon his return, Semmelweis would discover that one of his colleagues had also fallen ill with the infection and succumbed to it. It became clear that childbed fever wasn't only affecting women. But the question still remained. Why were more women succumbing to the fever in the doctor's ward than in the midwives? It turned out in the doctor's ward, autopsies were being performed, but not in the midwives' ward. This discovery led to another revelation. Semmelweis posited that the doctors who were performing the autopsies were then carrying infected particles to the birthing mothers, ultimately infecting them. So he ordered that the medical staff start cleaning their hands before delivering. Washing hands, however, would be done with a chlorine solution, not just soap. The physician, though, knew nothing about germs and instead believed that the solution would get rid of the smell that was on the doctor's hands. Upon imposing the new standard, the rate of childbed fever began to fall. You'd think that everyone would take this new discovery well, but they didn't. As far as the doctors were concerned, Semmelweis' suggestion made the medical professionals seem as though they were the ones infecting the women, and soon the hand-washing standard was met with pushback. Doctors quickly gave up the hand-washing rule, and Semmelweis would lose his job. He then traveled around Europe trying to convince other healthcare professionals to wash their hands, but he was ignored and berated. In a few years, he returned to the medical scene and was put in charge of the obstetrics department in a hospital in Pest, where childbed fever had broken out. He deployed...
Now you need me. Now you need me again. Like, what? See, the greats. He clearly had figured out a way to, if not slow it, probably eventually eradicate it altogether. But sometimes I feel like if you present something to people and they don't feel like it's their idea or something like that, they won't receive it well. You know a lot of people like that, don't you? If it didn't come from them or somebody that they deem credible, they won't listen to you. And then you'll be termed as crazy.
His standard again, and the mortality rate immediately began to reduce. In the meantime, Vienna was still battling against the infection. For years to come, the physician's warnings would go ignored throughout Vienna, which remained hostile towards him. Later in his life, Semmelweis' mental health deteriorated, and he found himself in an asylum. He would succumb, ironically, to the same infection that he battled against his whole life. After his passing, the once rejected theory was finally accepted by medical science. Disinfection, as he so suggested, played a major role in saving the lives of many women, and he was appropriately named Savior of Mothers. Number 9.
How many people had to die, though? I'm haunting you. I'm letting you know right now. I'm haunting you. I'm living back then, and I died, and I get up there, and right before I get ready to go through heaven gates, they show me why it happened, and it could have been prevented. Hold on a second, guys. I'll be right back. I promise you I'll be right back. I just got something I need to do real quick. I'm going to haunt them for a while. Yeah.
Harry Markopolos grew up in Erie, Pennsylvania, where he was the oldest of 3. He would start his career out on Wall Street as a broker for Makefield Securities. He then headed for Darien Capital Management and Rampart Investment Management. It would be during his affiliation with the Rampart Investment Management Company that Markopolos would be dubbed a whistleblower, an event that he would go into detail in his novel, titled No One Would Listen, a true financial thriller. What Harry was referring to in this title were the discoveries he made in the financial sector of a particular individual, but his claims had gone ignored. The financial thriller he was talking about regarded Bernard Madoff, a former NASDAQ chairman and the founder of the Wall Street firm Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC. It was Madoff who Markopolos believed was committing fraud through a Ponzi scheme. During his work at a firm, the chief investment officer walked out of his Boston office and headed for the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library. Working as the investment officer at a small firm, Markopolos specialized in trading stock options. In this role, he would get word of a New York competitor that was supposedly carrying out similar work, but was finding significantly more success. Eager to replicate the strategies of the competitor, Markopolos began an investigation. But when he did this, he found something strange. He couldn't do it. It wasn't because he didn't have the capabilities to, but rather it just wasn't possible. Something fishy was going on with the New York firm's numbers. By the end of that day, after employing his mathematical abilities, Markopolos not only suggested that something was amiss, but he was sure of it. It was right then and there that he decided to alert the appropriate authorities. After writing up a detailed report, he headed to the Kennedy Library, where he would anonymously hand-deliver his allegations to the New York State Attorney General, who just happened to be speaking there. The analysis, of course, was overflowing with equations and tabulations, but the bottom line was clear and daunting. It was impossible for the firm to be doing what it had claimed, suggesting that Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities was just one giant fraud. and the company was running the largest ever Ponzi scheme. But his claims and evidence were dismissed, and he was labeled as unhinged. This wasn't the first time that he had tried to warn the
labeled as unhinged? No. A lot of people were complicit in that Ponzi scheme probably and didn't want to give up or didn't want to be implicated or be shown that they were a part of it. See, when you figure out something like that, bro, automatically in my mind, I'm like, oh, brother, what did I just uncover? And I would be kind of hesitant to go to the authorities or be the whistleblower because it don't always end well for the whistleblower. Like, he was bold. I would have had to kind of set up some things and put some things in place before I went and became a whistleblower for that, bro. Like, some contingencies would have need to be in place for Bernie Madoff.
Relevant authorities, though. Since 1999, he'd made regular calls for investigation from the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission, and each time he supplied them with supporting documentation. In 2000, his claims were dismissed. In 2001, he was ignored. In 2002, he was shooed off, and in 2005, only a cursory investigation would take place. Markopolos' repeated warnings were ignored over and over again. It wouldn't be until 2008 that the scandal would finally unravel, and apologies were issued to the whistleblower. It was that year that Madoff made a grave mistake. He'd admitted his wrongdoings to his sons, who worked at the firm, and the next day, they would turn him over to the authorities. Number 8. In the early 1900s, Alfred Wegener would emerge as a revered German meteorologist and geophysicist. In 1910, he developed a knack for challenging accepted ideas, beginning with his disagreement with the explanation of the Bering Land Bridge. The accepted suggestion claimed that it was formed by isostasy, with similar land bridges having connected the continents. After reviewing, reading, researching, and investigating, Wegener would posit a new idea, the idea of Pangea. Wegener believed that the continents weren't connected via land bridges, but were once all fitted together, creating a supercontinent.
And I've always thought about that because when I first heard about Pangea, that kind of just blew my mind. It made me look at things different, right? But my thing is this: can we all one day come, just like we've now broken apart? Can we all come back together or be connected all together in some type of way? I don't know how. I was just wondering that, though. Is that a possibility?
Before drifting apart and forming the separate landmasses that we see today. This newfound hypothesis, though, came at a time when disputing known scientific claims was frowned upon. Adding to this was the fact that he didn't really have all the precise mechanisms of the idea worked out, although he did have a long list of evidence. The first piece of evidence that the scientists found was that the coastlines of a few of the continents seemed to match up, much like a jigsaw puzzle. This wouldn't be the first time that someone had suggested this, though. For decades, people had been noticing the similarities between the coastlines and believed that the continents had been ripped apart. Wegener, though, was synthesizing a massive amount of data all in one place. He used the true edges of landmasses to fit them together, ultimately resulting in better fits than the previous efforts. He would also find evidence in rocks, mountains, glacial formations, and fossils, each of which shared similarities in different areas of the world. For example, the fossils of a primitive reptile were found on the coastlines of Africa and South America, with another species being found in Africa, Antarctica, and India. He also pointed out that these were land dwellers who surely could not have swum across whole oceans. Wegener posited that the landmasses separated. Transoceanic land bridges still allowed animals and plants to move between them, but over time those bridges eroded, leaving the masses separated permanently. But this suggestion was seen as a fringe theory for the entirety of the scientist's life. The biggest issue with his hypothesis was his inability to provide a mechanism that explained how the continents would have moved apart, and so the poorly respected man's theory became lost to history. He passed away in 1930, and his concept of Pangea almost disappeared with him, as it was passed off as nothing more than fringe science. But then in the 1960s, scientists uncovered the missing mechanism that was present in the original hypothesis of Pangea. This evidence is related to the spreading of the sea floor. The discovery allowed Wegener's hypothesis on continental drift to be accepted, with regards to the idea of plate tectonics and how they shift. Number 7. Starting out as a small-town girl from the Midwest, Jean Seberg skyrocketed to stardom at the young age of 19, with her title role in Otto Preminger's St. Joan. Initially, Seberg would find herself living the American dream. It was the classic small-town girl becomes successful actress narrative. She and her second husband, Romain Gary, would find themselves being entertained by the Kennedys at the White House, and many women from France began cropping their hair into Seberg's signature pixie cut. The American dream, though, would take an eerie turn later in life. Amid her passion for acting, Seberg was also an activist. She donated much of her time and money to organizations such as the Black Panthers. She was drawn to this movement due to their Free Breakfast for Children project, but it would be this affiliation that led her to be viewed as crazy. As she became more embedded in the activism scene, Seberg began to make seemingly outlandish claims. She believed that she was being stalked, surveyed, and watched by the FBI. Seberg hasn't been the only famous individual to make such claims, be labeled as
If she'd have lived in this day and time, she would have realized that's a normal thought these days, bro. Everybody thinks like that. Come on, you'd fit right in with us. Right in with us. And don't think I don't be seeing y'all comments. Yeah, they watching y'all too, not just me. They on y'all.
Paranoid, and then later be proven right. Despite her pleas for help, family and friends believed that her claims were nothing more than the ramblings of a paranoid person, and chose not to believe her. This belief wasn't helped by the fact that the FBI had released a false tip to the local media. They'd claimed that the father of Seberg's baby, who was yet to be born, was a member of the Black Panther movement. After suffering a breakdown, she would deliver her daughter prematurely, resulting in a fatality. Following this event, Seberg and her husband sued one of the media platforms for defamation. They won $20,000 in damages. But the actress still lived in constant fear, and even with the knowledge that the FBI had leaked false information to discredit her, no one would take her seriously. It wasn't until Seberg's untimely passing that the truth would finally come to light. She was being surveyed by the Bureau, who were seeking to defame her due to her affiliation with various activist movements. The FBI revealed that they were stalking her through the J. Edgar Hoover-led COINTELPRO program, which made use of techniques such as intimidation. The investigation into Seberg wasn't just false, defamatory articles. She was being subjected to aggressive in-person stalking, burglaries, and other forms of harassment. For 9 years of the actress's life, she was being stalked by the FBI, according to records. She was initially laughed at and called crazy, but just like in similar cases, Seberg was right. She was being watched and harassed. Number 6.
See what I mean when I say, and I've said this in previous videos, bro, those people back then are owed the biggest apology. And I know that don't mean much because they're no longer here to receive it. But man, I feel bad for how they were done back then. People who were whistleblowing against the FBI or the CIA, or even those who were screaming at the top of their lungs about aliens. This day and age, in today's time, it's still people that are called you, but they're more crazier than you are. The person that's talking about aliens. Back then, they were outcasts, man, and I feel so bad for them. Because if they were alive today and see the conversations that are being had about the FBI, the CIA, and about aliens, they be in disbelief, bro. I bet they never thought we'd ever get to these type of times. I didn't either.
Roger Boisjoly was an American engineer, aerodynamicist, and fluid dynamicist who received his education at the University of Massachusetts. In other words, he knew exactly what he was talking about, and everyone should have listened to him when it came down to the launch of the Challenger, the space shuttle. For 27 years, Boisjoly worked in the aerospace industry, and in 1986 he found himself becoming a rocket engineer at NASA. But the engineer seemed slightly out of place. He was bald and tall and described as an imposing figure, which was only exasperated when he was armed with data. Data such as the failure of the booster rockets that would launch the Challenger into space. 6 months before the space shuttle's launch, Boisjoly found himself with some disturbing information. He'd reviewed the data of the booster rockets and found an error with the O-rings. He suggested that the cold temperatures would affect the O-rings and subsequently cause the failure of the boost rockets, leading to a catastrophic event of the highest order. Among his claims, he alleged that there would be a loss of human life. These discoveries would be detailed in a memo that Boisjoly sent to the managers of Thiokol. He explained in his report that the elastic seals at the booster rocket's joints were an issue. He suggested that the winter liftoff was far too risky, and the day of the launch, the 27th of January in 1986, had a forecast of temperatures as low as 30 degrees Fahrenheit. It was too dangerous to launch the Challenger. When this information confronted Thiokol, they agreed that the launch should be delayed at first. But when NASA officials held a conference call, they challenged Boisjoly's recommendation. George Hardy with NASA called the suggestion appalling, and the program manager, Lawrence Malloy, also failed to hide his disagreement. Pressure from the space agency forced the Thiokol managers to overrule Boisjoly, who was seen as an unhinged and out-of-place man with his remarks. And so the day was set. On the 27th of January in 1986, the Challenger began liftoff. The O-rings were subjected to cold temperatures, causing the rocket boosters to malfunction, just as predicted. The Challenger disaster wasn't only an embarrassment for NASA, but it was a tragedy for the rest of the nation. The event, including the fatalities...
It shouldn't have happened. Bottom line. It shouldn't have happened. If there's one person that is like, no, we can't do this, and provides a really good sound reasoning with supporting facts and everything like that as to why, that should be enough right there. People's lives are at stake. What do you mean? What do you mean? No. Again, hold on, God. I'm haunting you. I'm coming back to haunt you.
Of the crew on board was traumatizing. If only someone had warned them. Number 5. One of the founding professors of the Department of Nutrition at the Queen Elizabeth College in London was British nutritionist and physiologist John Yudkin. As a clinical academic, Yudkin found himself submerged in a variety of research interests. He focused on issues concerning diabetes, obesity, and overall global health. After spending 4 years in Tanzania working as a junior doctor, he became involved in work that sought to improve the cost-effective use of evidence-based medical care. In his research, he would collaborate with investigators from the United States, India, Mozambique, Australia, and various other areas. Yudkin studied at the University of Cambridge and began pursuing his PhD research in 1934. The following year, he began clinical studies while teaching as a professor at Cambridge. His medical studies were completed by 1938, and he was quickly appointed the Director of Medical Studies at Christ College. During his teaching days, Yudkin didn't stop his research into nutrition and overall health, which ultimately led him to world-changing conclusions. One such revelation came in the form of an attack on the sugar industry. In his 1972 book, Pure, White, and Deadly, Yudkin gained international attention. At the time, the leading food industries were peddling the idea that the consumption of fat was a leading cause of heart disease, obesity, and diabetes. But the professor challenged this idea and pointed the finger at the sugar industry instead. Yudkin explained that the consumption of sugar is dangerous to human health, an argument that he'd been making since 1957. He wrote in his book that sugar was a major factor in the development of obesity, diabetes, dental issues, and heart attacks. With so much medical experience under his belt, you'd think that the world would have listened to Yudkin, but they didn't. Of course, the incredibly powerful sugar industry wasn't about to let the professor's claims take hold. In response to his jolting diagnosis, the industry began to smear his reputation, buried his evidence, and continued to peddle the fat is bad belief. Yudkin faced an astonishing defeat, and his research was covered up.
And I was just saying this to somebody, bro. You got to think about it. Sugar is almost as addictive, if not more addictive than drugs, right? You probably don't, most people don't get their first drug until they're maybe in their teens or 20s, right? When they start on drugs. You're giving sugar when you're like a toddler. You start on sugar at like a toddler. So by the time you realize the damage that it's done to you, you're well into your adulthood. So getting off of sugar is way harder than any drug, bro. I was just saying this, man, way harder.
Adjoining food businesses to the sugar industry began flooding the shelves with food items marketed as low-fat, but the products were still laden with sugar, fueling the global health crisis. Yudkin's warnings were marginalized, and the tradition of sugar consumption continued. Later, another medical professional, Robert Lustig, began to suspect that sugar may have been behind the cases of childhood obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. The difference this time, though, was that he was backed by a prevailing wind. While Lustig, like Yudkin, was putting his entire career at risk, he pushed for more research to be conducted into sugar and its health effects on human bodies. Study after study soon brought to light an astonishing revelation. Sugar was the culprit all along, and not saturated fats, just as Yudkin had claimed. Number 4. In 1912, a flamboyant Yugoslav was born to the name Dusko Popov. His family was wealthy, and by the time World War II rolled around, Popov had found himself practicing law. At the very start, he began working for Germany's Abwehr. He'd been recruited into the organization by a German friend, Johann Jebsen, where he would become a spy. His first assignment was to head to France and report on any political leaders who may be of aid to the Germans. The lawyer was seen as a great asset, given his ties to France and the United Kingdom. Popov acquired the necessary information and sent it back to the Abwehr as required. But as time went on, Popov became deeply disturbed by what Europe was shaping up to be as a result of a violent war and a dictator. The crimes became too much for him to deal with, and he decided a change was necessary. So Popov decided to offer his spy services to the British. This meant that he would become a double agent. Following a detailed briefing by MI5, the lawyer's identity was positively confirmed, and the British Secret Service began making the necessary adjustments to accommodate their new recruit. They codenamed him Tricycle, a name that stemmed from the concept of Popov being a womanizer. An elaborate plan was set in place for Popov to ensure that he passed off as a genuine German agent while being under the direction of the British Secret Service. On various occasions, the unsuspecting Germans would hand the double agent top-secret files, in which they wanted him to provide German information concerning British arms, specifically about what types of military equipment were being manufactured. Popov and his British counterparts would conjure up bogus information to be sent back to the Abwehr. And then in March of 1941, an accident occurred in the streets of New York that claimed the life of Don Julio Lopez Ledo. This, of course, though, wasn't his real name. The man was actually Ulrich von der Osten, a leading member of Germany's intelligence service who'd been placed in the US to set up a spy ring. With this accident, Abwehr was one spy short and decided that Popov should fill the vacancy, and he was sent to the United States. Upon his arrival there in August of 1941, he received a new piece of spy paraphernalia from his German service. The document was written on a microdot, which needed to be affixed to a telegram for reading. That microdot was a list of questions that Germany's allies, the Japanese, wanted answered. Among the queries was information on a giant naval base located in the US. It was Pearl Harbor. Popov put two and two together and deciphered that the Japanese were planning an attack on the base. The agent knew that he needed to get this list to the FBI. After having to wait many days for a response from the Bureau, J. Edgar Hoover finally came to Washington to see it. Popov warned him of the impending attack on the naval base, but instead of investigating the claim, Hoover insulted the man. He claimed the agent was a scoundrel and even threatened to have him arrested. Hoover was untrusting of Popov due to his affiliations as a double agent. So his claim of—
Yeah, but even if you don't trust somebody, you still look into it. Why not? What does it hurt to even look into it? Or prepare just in case? You know what I'm saying? What? I don't understand that move at all.
Of the pending Pearl Harbor attack was ignored, a crucial mistake on the FBI's part. Number 3. How old is the Earth? This is a question that left scientists scratching their heads for decades. That is, until the Iowa scientist, Clair Patterson, thinks she solved the mystery. Patterson, a geochemist who graduated from Grinnell College, He believed he was able to determine the Earth's age back in 1956 by studying the lead contents embedded in the ground. The Earth was guessed to be 4.5 billion years old, the number that we still use today. His research and testing would take several years to complete, with his methods and results often being questioned. But while he was on his venture to determine how old the planet was, he also discovered something truly alarming. The information regarding lead contents and objects that had already been published was wrong. Common objects, including lead pipes, food cans, and paint, were incredibly harmful to human life. Patterson also took various samples from places all over the world, only to find that the atmosphere is more contaminated than we thought. In fact, he deduced that modern society may have more than 100 times the ideal amount of lead in our bodies than our pre-industrial ancestors. The clear, oily liquid known as tetraethyl lead was everywhere. It was sprayed on produce to keep insects away, and then it was added to gasoline, which became a dangerous perpetrator of the chemical. When a person is exposed to too much lead, they may suffer from cancer, hearing loss, blindness, kidney failure, and sometimes loss of life. In 1965, Patterson summed up his research in a published paper titled Contaminated and Natural Lead Environments of Man. This marked the beginning of his efforts to draw public attention to the increasing issue. He further criticized the experimental methods of other scientific figures, and in turn would be faced with strong opposition. Not only did the fuel and oil industry come after Patterson, but he also refused contact with several neutral research organizations. Due to his criticism of the lead industry, he would be excluded from the National Research Council on Atmospheric Lead Contamination, despite being a singular expert on the topic. The oil industry barred him from receiving any further research funding, and they even funded counter-research to dispute his claims. Patterson, though, refused to back down, and with the aid of fellow researcher T.J. Chow, they were able to determine that lead contamination was 10 to 100 times greater on Mount Lassen than at sea. This meant that the lead had come from the sky. Patterson and Chow resumed their research and were able to determine that the same samples from Mount Lassen matched with air samples from Los Angeles, and they even matched with gasoline samples that had been acquired earlier. It wasn't until further studies, research, and more papers that the Clean Air Act finally came into play in 1970, several years after Patterson had initially waged war on the lead industry. After initially being ignored, barred, dismissed, and discounted, the geochemist was right all along. Number 2. Dr. Bennet Omalu was born in Nigeria in 1968, amid the Nigerian Civil War, a conflict that would force his family to leave their village. After returning to the comfort of their home when the war was over, Omalu found himself becoming a gifted student in school, who exhibited a great imagination. At first, he dreamed of becoming an airline pilot, but later changed his direction and focused on a career in medicine. At the age of 15, he began medical school at the University of Nigeria and interned at Jos University Hospital. His residency was held at Harlem Hospital Center, where he developed a keen interest in pathology. He completed his fellowship in neuropathology in 2002. By this time, it was clear he had quite a lot of experience and education in the field of medicine, which made it such a shock that high-up NFL figures and medical practitioners discounted his discovery. Today, we know that the brains of star athletes can potentially become damaged in the future.
CTE, right? Is this the guy? I can't remember the guy's name that Will Smith made the movie. Did the movie? It gotta be CTE they talking about, though.
Repeated head trauma that football players sustain can lead to a condition known as chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. The person who discovered this condition was Dr. Omalu in 2002. While working at the coroner's office, Omalu had examined the body of Mike Webster, the former pro footballer who played for the NFL's Pittsburgh Steelers. Webster had displayed patterns of some serious and odd behavior before his heart attack at the age of 50. The doctor was curious as to what clues the player's brain may hold. After a careful examination, he discovered clumps of proteins, which are known to cause impairments. The clues presented similarly to dementia. This condition, though, wasn't connected to football players until Omalu's discovery. After further research, he was able to confirm his findings on CTE being present in NFL footballers. And of course, his research was discounted, and Omalu received notable pushback from the NFL's Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee.
Yeah, they ain't want him affecting that money. They ain't want him stopping nothing. That was stopping their money right there. They ain't care about the players. They still don't. They don't. This is interesting, so interesting to me though, man. Because it's like, imagine the players if they had the option to know this could be the end result. Because if you listen to how some players say it's a car collision every time. Every time they go to hit somebody, it's a car collision. It's that type of impact. So if they would have known now, some players, they won't care. They would still do it. Some players, not so much. They would have went an alternative route. Preserve life route.
2005, the doctor published a paper to inform the committee of his discovery, but instead of researching the case further, they demanded a retraction. But Omalu refused to back down and continued with his research. Next on the coroner's examination table was 45-year-old Terry Long, another former football player. In his brain, the same protein buildup was present. The doctor then published another paper, but the MTBI, a mouthpiece of the NFL, discredited the research again and claimed that it was flawed. They refused to acknowledge any possible link between the rough sport and brain damage in players. Despite receiving pushback, Omalu still gained supporters from the chairman of neurosurgery, Dr. Julian Bales. With such support, he was able to found the Sports Legacy Institute to further his studies of CTE. In 2007, the doctor moved to California and continued his postgraduate education while working as a medical examiner. In 2008, he published his first book relating to football, dementia, and its links to CTE. It wasn't until 2009, though, that Omalu's research had finally begun to bear fruit. For years, he was being called a fraud, and the NFL was desperately trying to bury him. That was until more and more football players began to suffer from memory loss. After further research by other medical practitioners, Commissioner Goodell and NFL executives were called in to testify before the House of Judiciary Committee. This would ultimately spark an overhaul of MTBI and introduce changes to safety regulations within the sport, with thousands of former players bringing multiple lawsuits against them. The league was now forced to acknowledge the dangers of head trauma, concussions, and their links to CTE, as warned by Dr. Omalu. Number 1.
Man, imagine how many could... Don't get me wrong, it's still concussions going on and taking place. If you watch NFL, you see it all the time. Somebody get up and they stumbling, they try to get them over there to that blue tent area pretty quick, and then you see them walking back towards the way they came out, back to the locker room, helmet in hand. Yeah. And then they're in concussion protocol for like a week or so. Yeah, if you play fantasy football, you know about this because it's normally your players. I know it'd be mine. But think about all those players back in the day, though, that had no clue of what was going on. Well, they probably had some clue, but they probably wasn't caring the money they was making. Man, he saved some lives, though, for sure, or at least prolonged some.
Wife of John Mitchell, the United States Attorney General under Richard Nixon, was named Crazy. Martha Mitchell was born in Pine Bluff, Arkansas in 1919 and graduated from high school, attended college and multiple universities, and ultimately fell head over heels for Mitchell, impressed by his suaveness and intellect. On New Year's Eve of 1966, Nixon and Mitchell's professional careers would converge as their offices combined. 2 years later, Nixon will become president with Mitchell as his attorney general. Mitchell's wife, Martha, became a notable public figure with her outspokenness and unrestrained comments about politics. Such unrestrained comments would become prevalent in the Watergate scandal. In February of 1972, Martha's husband would resign as attorney general in order to chair Nixon's re-election committee. In June of that same year, a group of men were arrested for breaking into the Democratic National Committee's official office, located at the Watergate complex. Mitchell denied that the burglary was connected to the White House, but Martha had something else to say. She knew who one of the burglars was and was aware that he was part of the re-election committee. Martha would also learn a lot more about the Watergate scandal by eavesdropping on her husband's calls and meetings and also looking through his papers. Mitchell attempted to hide the details of the burglary from his wife, but after seeing a newspaper headline, she knew that something was up. Just days later, she would phone the United Press International reporter, saying that she'd given her husband an ultimatum, her or politics. Before she was able to reveal anything, though, the call was cut. Martha began telling people that she was being prevented from contacting anyone, and at one point, she alleged that she was injected with a tranquilizer. Of course, these claims were viewed as nothing more than the crazy babblings of an unhinged woman. Mitchell resigned as the manager of the campaign, claiming that he needed to look after his wife. At the same time, stories began to spread that Martha was having a mental crisis. News spread that she was in a psychiatric facility, but when she made a reappearance, Martha told a different story. She was being held hostage in a hotel so that she wouldn't spread news about an alleged scandal relating to the Nixon re-election campaign. She also proceeded to detail what she knew.
Now tell me y'all don't think this still take place. And I'm going to call you a liar right to your face. You know it's still this type of stuff going on. Each election, there's some type of scandal going on, and there's somebody who want to tell, but they're being threatened and silenced. You know it's true. They either paid off, threatened, silenced in some sort of way.
Of the scandal. Despite Mitchell's wife being viewed as crazy, the media just couldn't resist investigating. And it didn't take long before that revelation came. That revelation came from the mouth of one of the burglars, who said that he believed that the break-in was sanctioned by John Mitchell. This case led to the naming of the Martha Mitchell effect, the term used in which someone tells an unbelievable tale that's considered delusional, but later turns out to be true.